In spite of the risks, thousands of Africans still try to cross the Mediterranean Sea to Europe, and many have lost their lives in these desperate journeys. Each day in the last decade, the migration crisis has deepened. But this isn't to say Europe and Africa have merely watched as bystanders. Leaders from either side of the Mediterranean Sea have gathered in their latest attempt to chart a path out of the crisis. So what is being done to stem the tide? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, Tunisia has become a focal point for migrants heading to Europe. To stem the flow of refugees, the country's Coast Guard have mounted regular patrols at strategic crossings. CGTN joined the Tunisian Maritime National Guard in one such mission. Take a listen.
A few hours before midnight, the 35-meter patrol boat left a secure location near the port of Sfax. The Maritime National Guard vessel stopped in Tunisian territorial waters, and the anchor was lowered in a strategic location. The Tunisian Maritime National Guard is responsible for covering and patrolling a huge area. The country's coastline, especially the port city of Sfax, is the main point of departure for thousands of undocumented migrants. The captain spotted the first migrant boat on the radar. Two Coast Guard patrol units tracked the makeshift vessel in the darkness. As the cramped boat emerged, over 40 sub-Saharan African migrants begged to be left to continue the risky journey.
We are sorry, but please let us go. It is our last chance. We tried and failed 5 times. Let us do it once more. Please don't stop us. We spent all our money on this journey. We don't have any money or food left. We have nowhere else to go. Please pardon us and let us continue.
Osman, a 22-year-old migrant from Mali, is the only person who accepted to leave this overcrowded boat without resistance.
Life is so hard here. The situation is very bad in my country. I just want to go to Europe to have a better life.
The Maritime National Guard has intercepted this makeshift boat carrying more than 40 irregular migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, but this group has refused to stop. The Coast Guards informed the migrants that their vessel could capsize any time due to bad weather conditions ahead. The National Guard ship cast a rope to save the migrants, but they responded with threats of violence, using iron and wooden sticks, as well as shovels and other sharp tools.
We have recorded a rise in violence perpetrated by migrants from sub-Saharan Africa during rescue operations. Many are using sharp tools and knives. Migrants are often threatening to throw babies into the sea to prevent our units from apprehending them. The captain of a migrant boat who stops is thrown into the sea so as to slow down the maritime guards.
Tunisian Coast Guards say they are increasingly being threatened at sea when stopping migrant boats. The Sfax Public Prosecutor's Office has recently ordered the opening of a judicial investigation and the arrest of 4 sub-Saharan African migrants who poured gasoline and tried to set a Tunisian Maritime National Guard speedboat on fire. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Sfax.
Well, joining me now to discuss the issues on the table in the continuing efforts towards finding a lasting solution to the migration crisis is our panel of experts from Johannesburg. Otilia Anna Maunganidze, migration expert and head of special projects in the Office of the Executive Director at the Institute of Security Studies. In London, Tarek Megarisi, Senior Policy Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And from Trento in Italy, Professor Giuseppe Schiottino, Director of the Department of Sociology and Social Research at the University of Trento. A warm welcome to you all and thank you for being a part of these discussions. Otilia, if I may start off with you, let me start off with a quote by Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. She said, and I quote, "The West too often has given the impression of being more interested in giving lessons rather than lending a hand. It is probably this arrogance that has made it difficult to make progress on solutions, end quote. Do you agree?
In part, yes, but I think there's also a lack of humility in that statement, because the idea that the lessons or attempting to give lessons is only coming from Europe takes away African engagement and involvement on questions of migration, which precede what Europe currently regards as a crisis.
Right. Tarek, what's your thought on this?
We don't see an arrogant Europe talking about values and not helping. We see a disingenuous Europe with Meloni talking about how she wants to lend a hand. But if you look at her actions instead of her words, she is giving money and she is giving equipment and she's giving support to the dictators and to the oppressive security services that are actually, as we speak, they are condemning migrants and refugees to die in the desert between Tunisia and Libya. So I don't think that they are really trying to resolve the issue. I think they are trying to provide the appearance to their home audiences that they are resolving this issue. And so you see meetings in Tunis with a lot of cameras around, big announcements of money given. But there's no substantive policy that's actually there to help stop migration, to provide safer legal routes, to provide a safer and welcoming place for them to stay in transit while they can be processed. There are no solutions on the table, just money and photo ops.
Money and photo ops. Professor Sciotino, what's your view?
There is not really nothing new. I mean, these tragedies and this problem has been actually with us for quite a long time. Even if they shock us with tragedies, but they happen every day and for decades. The problem is basically that migration control is always a devil game. If you never do it right. On one side, clearly, the European Union has a very paradoxical structure in which it guarantees quite a lot of rights to the people who are on the territory of the Union, but try to make it difficult for people to arrive in the Union to enjoy this right. So somewhat, it creates an incentive and it creates a discouragement at the same time. And in order to solve this, the European Union and Mediterranean European states try to involve transit country on the southern rim of the Mediterranean in order to avoid tragedies and people drowning in the sea. But that means that this country, if they are effective and if they really want to stop, end up condemning people to death in the desert, joining this country. So it's really difficult, I would say.
So, Otile, I want to go back a little bit to find out exactly what happens when migrants arrive on European shores versus what happens when they're leaving Africa. There have been previous efforts to assist countries of origin, and both Italy and the European Commission have now increased engagement with Tunisia, where many irregular migrants are starting their journey. Take us through how challenging it has been to prevent the departure of migrant boats and combat smuggling.
So 2 levels. The first, I'll speak about regular migration, which is the pathways that the majority of African migrants take. And for that one, of course, this is your ordinary process of applying for a visa and moving or traveling to a European country. The second, which is the irregular migration, where the people being smuggled or trafficked out of Africa into Europe, which is the smaller portion of people moving. The emphasis has, of course, been on the latter, so less around how do you leverage legal pathways and more around stemming, in the words of the European Union, stemming the flow of migrants out of Africa into Europe. What has happened then is we have seen an outsourcing in part of a securitized policy. So before we even get to Europe, while we are on the African continent, we see countries, you mentioned Tunisia, but we also see countries further south like Niger adopting policies meant to push people back. But if you don't address the push factors, or on the other hand, also the pull factors of why people are leaving their home countries and what is driving them towards Europe, then all you do is you increase their precarious options. So what I'm saying is the number of people is unlikely to reduce. What is likely to increase is the number of people that opt for more dangerous routes or people that are smuggled at a higher cost. And that is what we have seen through Institute for Security Studies research dating back now 8 years, that when you have these restrictive policies trying to push people back at the borders, you actually just increase the cost of that movement. You don't reduce the numbers. So in the long term, it becomes a waste of money rather than an investment in a workable migrant and migrant governance solution.
All right. Tarek, I want to look at that pragmatic solution for a moment there, because I'd like to also quote Prime Minister Maloney, who's also argued that if the situation, however, was better managed, there would be more room for legal migration. Who or at what stage do we feel that this process has been mismanaged?
Once again, I find myself agreeing with the words of Prime Minister Maloney, but finding them slightly disingenuous. When has it been mismanaged? When has it been managed? I think that there is an improper perception that is being advanced by politicians, especially on the right wing, that you can have borders that are either open or completely shut. And this is incorrect. This is a wrong way of looking at the situation. The problem is that the fear of migration, the hysteria that's painted around migration, especially by some political factions in Europe, it closes the policy space to enable us to actually find pragmatic solutions and to manage them. You know, there have been policy solutions on the table for 5-10 years now, but the reason why they're not explored is because the politicians feel too scared to touch them, because they feel like if they talk to their electorate about managing borders, about admitting certain amounts of people, about increasing visas or using these kind of tools, then they will get wiped out at the next election. And so really we have to solve the political problem before we can start to use the policy tools that we have at our disposal.
Professor, you know, let's look at that recent conference in Italy for the moment, because Italy launched what it called the Rome process, which is aimed at tackling irregular migration as usual and human trafficking. How does this Rome process, though, differ from the previous efforts to address irregular migration?
Actually, it's more or less the same line the Italian governments of various colors and various coalitions have had in the last decades, I would say. There is clearly a novelty, which is the fact that Prime Minister Meloni, who was elected on a very kind of anti-migration platform, is actually now endorsing, let's say, a mainstream position. So this is the political novelty in a certain sense. But this mainstream position is mainstream. It has been mainstream and largely ineffective for decades and decades, because it's all predicated on the fact that people migrating irregularly migrate irregularly either because they are victim of trafficking or because they don't know the real conditions of migrants in Europe. Unfortunately, people go to trafficking because trafficking is one of the few options to arrive in Europe. And they know perfectly well what the risk, I'm afraid.
So, Tarek, you know, the Rome process will not differ much from what else, you know, has been proposed out there. Give us your view, though, if you think how much or to what extent it will be adequate to address the migrant crisis in terms of human rights, particularly, and humane migration.
If we look and we see what's there on paper, we have a utopia coming towards us, and it's going to be fantastic. In some of the articles, you see, you know, real organization and direction of efforts towards solving some of the drivers of migration, towards working on development and fighting climate change and so on with countries of origin, with support for countries of transit to help them better manage these kind of flows of migrants and refugees, for better processing of refugees, offering more visas and safe routes for economic migrants who wish to come, and even, you know, articles that talk about the respect and the human rights of migrants and refugees. But I think that the kind of watchword for this conference and for this current bout of policy towards migration is disingenuity. I do not believe that most of what we see on paper will come to fruition. I think that Prime Minister Meloni has very smartly brought in organizations like the European Bank of Development, the African Development Bank, and so on, which will instigate some big projects. And I think that might have, some good economic impact, which fits in with Prime Minister Meloni's other goals. But in terms of stopping migration or ensuring that ensuring that migrants and refugees are treated or given their rights, I don't think we'll see anything. And the perfect example of this is, who has been Prime Minister Meloni's closest migration partner for the last 6 months? President Kais Saied in Tunis and from Tunisia. And the Tunisian authorities just announced that 901 people have died so far this year trying to cross the sea towards Italy. And at the same time, as we speak, there are people dying in the desert from starvation, from lack of water, from heat stroke as the temperature reaches 50 degrees, whilst they are pushed back by the same security services that are funded and provided resources by the European Union and the Italian government and other European governments. So I think that there's a big discrepancy between what we see at the conference and what the reality of the policies look like. And until we bridge this gap, until we can get some of those words off the paper and into policy, it's just going to get worse.
Otilia, let me come back to you on this.
It's certainly not going to do much for the human rights and humane migration component, to be frank, because we have seen, for example, through other engagements, the co-option of Libyan security forces in the efforts to arrest migration. And what we know of that is we have seen people either in slave-like conditions or, in fact, migrant human rights being violated. So it's not going to make things better on the human rights scale. It might make things better for countries that are intending to push back migrants, but this is for states, not for the migrants themselves. And I think we do need to have a reflection and a conversation, one, on what states may want, and then two, on what people themselves, whether people on the move or the societies hosting them may want. And at the moment, we're having a conversation more at state level without the involvement of civil society organizations, human rights organizations, many of whom over the past decade have been collecting a lot of information from the ground around the ways in which these pushback efforts actually impinge on human rights rather than promote them.
All right, and on that note, let's take a short break. When we come back, we'll look at the outcomes of the recent migration talks in Europe and how these are likely to impact the crisis. Stay tuned to find out what changes are expected following this conference. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now let's continue with the discussion. Still with me in Johannesburg, Otilia Anna Maunganidze. In London, Tarek Megerisi. And in Trento, Italy, Professor Giuseppe Schiottino. So, Otilia, the IOM, International Organization for Migration, gives very bleak figures of how many people actually die, in the Mediterranean. And it has recorded nearly 25,000 drownings in the Mediterranean Sea since 2014, though, of course, the true death toll could likely be much higher. How would you assess the effectiveness of current European policies and strategies in addressing these migration challenges in the Mediterranean?
Counting the human cost of policies is really important, because when the Valletta process was initiated almost a decade ago, one would have hoped that by 2023, the numbers of people risking their lives to cross, whether through the Mediterranean or the Sahara, would have been reduced. But in fact, that hasn't been the case. So the impact of the policies directly on the ground has not been what is the intended impact. one, reducing the numbers of people taking risks to cross. In fact, we're seeing an increase, particularly as the weather starts to ease around this summer period in the Northern Hemisphere is when we see an increase in numbers. And I have to repeat this point without reflecting on the fact that past policies have not worked, past practices have not worked. Countries will continue to repeat the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Right now, we're not focusing on addressing that. It's more focusing on just limit the numbers of people that reach Europe. That is not humane.
Tarek, now the Global Compact on Migration puts human rights at the heart of the Global Migration Compact. Yet the Europeans' approach to external border control has been criticized for its focus on securitization and criminalization of search and rescue efforts. Has human rights and safety of migrants been shelved in favor of curbing the arrival of migrants on European shores?
Absolutely. And to be fair, I don't think it's just the Europeans who do this. The United Kingdom takes a similar approach. If you look elsewhere in the world, as far afield as Malaysia or Australia, it seems like the global approach of dealing with migrants is to securitize it, to criminalize search and rescue, to focus on this idea that it's an activity driven by people smugglers instead of an activity driven by humanity in itself. And so, yes, unfortunately, human rights are often shelved in pursuit of border externalization, in pursuit of securitization. I think we can see quite clearly with the numbers which continue to increase that it hasn't had much of a deterrence impact. And I think that this was proven during the debates over Operation Sophia, which was an EU naval mission, which initially had search and rescue protocols in it. And many of the member states of the EU then complained in kind of parliament sessions that this was creating a pull factor for migrants, that migrants were more willing to kind of take this journey because they knew that naval vessels would keep them safe and pick them up. So eventually this was removed. But still, the boats keep coming and people keep coming, which shows you that, no, it doesn't create much of a deterrence factor. I think for many of these people, it's an existential issue, but I think my colleague disagrees with me. So,
unfortunately, I mean, I think it's inhumane, but it works. I mean, see the number of people landing in 2016, 17, and the number of people landing now, the numbers are unbelievably lower. It doesn't mean that it's good and doesn't mean that it's wise, but surely the problem is without this kind of control, the number of people moving would be for very rational reason that any migrant can explain, much, much larger. I mean, when we do surveys or interviews in sending countries, people honestly tells you, I mean, I would move if it weren't so dangerous.
Tarek?
I would add to that if you look at the statistics collected by the International Organization on Migration, you do see an increase in the amount of people that are dying at sea. We see an increase in the amount that are collected by border forces like the Libyan Coast Guard. And they are kind of trapped in this cycle whereby they leave, they are picked up by the Coast Guard, returned to militia groups in Libya, and then they pay for travel once again. So they're kind of trapped in an eternal cycle until they get out. So it hasn't decreased the number of people trying to migrate. It just temporarily kind of patches the number of those that get to Europe with often horrific consequences. And I think that because of Europe closing its kind of visa system since the 1990s, really, and making it so difficult for economic migrants to travel, even though there is a labor market demand, many of these migrants feel like the only way they can get to Europe is to pretend to be a refugee. And they'll figure it out once they get to Europe. So really the logical approach to resolving that is to explore kind of expanded visa programs that then give you more political control over how many migrants are coming in, being able to integrate them, to channel them towards training or immediate job markets if you need them for low-skilled work and so on. And this is what I mean when I say you have to manage borders, because this wave of people coming in a completely uncontrolled fashion is what creates popular anxiety. And it means that these people are condemned even when they get to Europe.
Right. So, Otilia, looking ahead, what improvements do you think need to be made to better address the challenges of irregular migration, both, of course, from the European Union shores and as well as from countries of origin?
Right, so there's a recognition that migration is a development issue, migration is also a security issue, and migration is also an issue of integration and inclusion. Strategies and policies that look to these three elements, but also that connect them, are the right way forward. It cannot be that you only have a securitized approach to the way in which you govern migration. You also have to balance it, as I said, with development initiatives. Practically, that is everything from infrastructural development, enhancing the education sector, and ensuring greater access to the market for the over 1.3 billion Africans within their home countries and within their sub-regions. Initiatives such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, married with freedom of movement on the continent, can be a way to leverage that, but it has to be well managed. And that is where the security component comes in. It comes in as part of governance, not only just about pushing people back, but ensuring that we actually ensure more people are moving through regular channels. It does also mean visa liberalization, options for education and employment outside of your home countries with a view to contributing back. The final thing that I would want to say on this is, of course, other policies related to migrancy, such as remittances policies, will be key drivers of that development. We're already seeing that a number of African countries, for example, Zimbabwe, Somalia, Kenya, Egypt, and Ghana, are getting a lot more income from remittances than they get from overseas development assistance or foreign direct investment. So let's leverage, of course, the development potential of migration while managing some of the risks that come with irregular migration.
And Otilia, you have a final word here on this. Going forward, what is likely to change, particularly after the Rome process?
I'm a little bit concerned about where we are going. So I do not know whether the Rome process will yield as much positive results as it could the negative. I am concerned, of course, that some of the key partners, such as Tunisia, have been criticized already for having xenophobic policies, particularly towards migrants from Western Africa. What I can say is this is a process that we need to be monitoring closely, and we need to be focusing, and I have to stress this, on ensuring that this policy does not take a toll on humanity, but actually allows us to be able to reduce the number of people dying while trying to cross the Mediterranean, while also ensuring greater access to the economy, greater access to education and development on the African continent.
All right, a very interesting discussion indeed. And that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts from Johannesburg, Otilia Anna Maunganidze, migration expert and head of special projects in the Office of the Executive Director at the Institute of Security Studies. In London, Tarek Megerisi, Senior Policy Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And in Trento, Italy, Professor Giuseppe Schiottino, Director of the Department of Sociology and Social Research at the University of Trento. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.